The chapel of St. Alban stood full to its cold stone walls, on the second morning of October, and every soul inside it had come to watch a duke marry one woman, while another waited in the vestry with her wedding gloves still buttoned at the wrist. Eleanor Crane stood at the side door with her hand pressed flat against the painted wood, listening to the murmur of 200 guests who had been told only that week that the bride had been changed. They did not say her name in the pews. They said the other one. They said Lady Marguerite, the diamond, the cousin with the dowry, and they said it with the small, satisfied sound a room makes when it believes order has been restored. Eleanor was 24 years old, and she had been promised to the Duke of Hartmore since the spring by his own hand, in a letter she still carried folded against her ribs. She had worn the gown her mother had altered by candlelight. She had come to the church. She had been turned at the threshold by a footman who would not meet her eyes. To the assembled gentry of 3 counties, she was already a settled matter. A misunderstanding tidied away. A woman who had presumed. She did not weep, because weeping was a thing the body did when it still expected to be answered. And Eleanor had stopped expecting that, somewhere on the long walk from the carriage to the locked side door. What she felt instead was a strange, clean stillness, the kind that comes after a fall before the pain arrives. Somewhere beyond the wall, a man's voice was speaking the opening words of the rite, level and unhurried, and she knew that voice. She had heard it read poetry badly, and laugh at itself for the badness. She pressed her palm harder to the door. If you have ever stood at a threshold the world has decided is not yours, stay with me, because this is the story of a door that opened the wrong way for everyone who thought they had shut it. She had not come alone. That was the thing the chapel did not yet understand. Behind her in the gray morning light stood an old man in the plain, dark cassock and the corded hat of his office, a man whose face the whole of the county knew from a single glimpse, and whose name no footman would dare refuse. And he had taken Eleanor's arm the way a grandfather takes the arm of a girl he has decided to deliver somewhere. The Bishop of Crail was 80 if he was a day, and he had buried Eleanor's father with his own hands. And he had read the letter she carried, and he had said, in the carriage, that the church did not exist to make liars comfortable. Eleanor had not understood what he meant to do. She understood only that he meant to do it in front of everyone. The Duke of Hartmore was named Adrian, though almost no one alive used it, and he stood at the altar in a coat the color of deep water, with his hands folded and his jaw set like carved stone. He was 32, broad through the shoulder, dark-haired, with a face the season had long ago decided was cold because it did not give itself away. Beside him stood Lady Marguerite, in white silk and his late mother's pearls, lovely and composed, and entirely certain of her ground. The dowager at the front pew sat very straight beneath a fan, held a careful half-inch too high, and her name was Lady Hartmore, and she had arranged all of this, every thread of it, in 11 days. She had a reason. She believed her reason. Absolutely. What? That was what made her dangerous, and that was what would, in the end, undo her. The thing the dowager had done was not complicated. Adrian had offered for Eleanor Crane in March, when the Crane fortune was thought secure and the Crane name unblemished, and then in September, Eleanor's father had died and left behind a tangle of debts and a contested will, and overnight, the daughter of a respectable gentleman became, in the dowager's calculus, a woman with nothing. The dowager had moved at once. She had produced Marguerite, her own sister's child, with £30,000 and a clean line, and she had told her son that the Crane engagement was an embarrassment the family would not survive, and she had set the wedding for the 2nd of October before her son could think too long. Adrian had not refused her. That was the fact. Eleanor could not get past. He had not refused. What Eleanor did not know, what no one in that chapel knew except the Duke himself, was that Adrian had spent 11 nights not sleeping, and that the letter he had written her in March was not the only letter he had written, and that there was a thing he carried in the breast of his coat that he touched, now once, with 2 fingers. the way a man touches a wound to see if it still bleeds. Eleanor had met him first, not at a ball but at a bookseller's, in the market town near Hartmoor, on a wet afternoon the previous spring, when she had been kneeling on the shop floor gathering up a child's spilled basket of apples and he had come in out of the rain. She had not known who he was. The child, a small boy with a runny nose and a mother weeping quietly over a torn flour sack at the counter, had upended the basket in his fright, and the apples had gone everywhere across the wet boards, under the shelves, against the boots of a tall man who had just come in dripping from the rain. Eleanor had been down on her knees already gathering, and she had looked up at the boots, and then at the man above them, and had handed him the nearest apple, and told him he might as well make himself useful. He had stood there, holding it with an expression she had taken for offense, and had only much later understood to be astonishment, because no one in 15 years had told the Duke to make himself useful, and certainly no one had done it on the floor of a market-town bookseller's, while a poor woman wept at the counter. He had looked at the apple. He had looked at her. Then he had crouched down on the wet boards in his fine coat, the hem of it soaking through, and he had gathered the fallen fruit beside her without a word, reaching under the lowest shelf for what had rolled where she could not. When the basket was full, he had carried it to the counter himself and set it down, and, quietly, he had paid the woman's torn account and the flour both, and he had done it in a low voice so the boy would not hear his mother thanked for charity, and Eleanor had watched the whole of it from the floor. When she rose, he had asked her name, as though it were a thing he intended to keep, and she had given it, and he had said it back to her once, carefully, getting the shape of it right. That was the quality of attention the season never saw in him because the season only ever saw the stone. Eleanor had seen the man crouch on a wet floor. It had ruined her for caution. Now she stood at a locked door while he married someone else, and the old bishop beside her shifted his weight and said, very quietly, that it was time. He did not knock. A bishop does not knock. He simply turned the handle that the footman had locked, because a footman's lock means nothing against the church, and he drew the door open, and the gray light of the side aisle fell across the stone, and Eleanor walked into the chapel of St. Alvan on the arm of the Bishop of Crail, while the Duke was halfway through the vow that would have bound him to another woman. The rite stopped. It did not trail off. It stopped, the way a clock stops, all at once, and into a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the candles. 200 faces turned. The vicar conducting the service, a thin, nervous man who had not been told there was a bishop in the county, went the color of tallow and half rose from his place. Marguerite's certainty did not crack so much as freeze, her chin lifting a fraction, her hand tightening on her bouquet. And the dowager, at the front, brought her fan down at last, and turned in her seat with the slow, deliberate motion of a woman recalculating a sum she had thought already settled. Adrian turned too. And the thing that happened in his face when he saw her was not relief and was not guilt, though both were in it. It was the look of a man who has been holding his breath so long he has forgotten he is doing it, and who has just been told he may stop. He did not move toward her, not yet. The discipline of 30 years held him in place at the altar rail, and Eleanor, walking up the aisle with the slow ceremony the bishop's pace imposed, watched his hands and saw that they were not folded anymore. One had gone to the breast of his coat. He was touching the thing he carried there again, and she could not see what it was. She would not learn for some hours yet. But the audience of her own heart had begun to suspect, before her mind would permit it, that whatever he had carried it for her. The bishop brought her to a halt at the foot of the chancel steps. In the dreadful silence he spoke, and his old voice carried to the back wall without effort, because he had spent 60 years learning to be heard in stone rooms. He said that he had come to witness a marriage, and that he had read the settlements, and that he found in them a prior promise, made in writing, under seal, by the gentleman now standing at the altar. He said the word promise the way other men said the word God. Then he looked at Adrian and he asked him, in front of 200 witnesses, whether he denied the letter of march. The dowager rose to her feet. She said her son had been released from any rash spring promised by the change in the lady's circumstances, and she said it in the polished hierarchy-protective voice of a woman who had never once in her life been contradicted in public, and several heads near the front nodded, because it was the correct thing, the sensible thing. The thing the order required. Lady Hartmore was not cruel in the way a villain is cruel. She believed she was rescuing her son from a ruinous attachment, and she believed it with her whole heart, and that belief had let her lock a grieving girl out of a church and feel virtuous doing it. Eleanor did not look at the dowager. She looked at Adrian, and she found that she could not read him, and the old wound spoke up in her then, the one her father's death had carved and the dowager had salted, that she was a woman a man could promise himself to in spring and forget by autumn, that she had presumed, that the letter against her ribs was the foolish keepsake of a girl who had mistaken kindness for choice. I should tell you that she was wrong about him. She did not know it yet, and the not knowing is the engine of everything that follows. So let me only say this, and then return to the cold chapel. The body knows before the mind consents, and Eleanor's body, standing at the foot of those steps, had already turned toward him the way a plant turns without permission toward light. To understand what came next, you must understand what Eleanor had done in the 11 days between her father's death and this morning, because the Duke knew and the dowager did not, and the difference between what they knew was the whole difference between them. When the elder Crane died, his affairs were found to be a wreckage. There were debts to a moneylender named Fenn. There was a mortgage on the small estate at Wexley that had been quietly renewed 3 times. And there was a clause in the will that left everything contingent on a sum that did not exist. Most gentlewomen in Eleanor's position would have retreated to a relative's charity, and let the lawyers strip the house. Eleanor had instead gone through her father's papers herself, night after night, and had found beneath the despair of the ledgers that her father had been swindled, that Fenn had charged interest no court would uphold, and that the contested clause rested on a forged codicil. She had not gone to a man to fix it. She had gone to the bishop who had known her father since both of them were young, and she had laid the forged codicil on his desk in the cold light of his study, and shown him, with her own ungloved finger, where the hand changed. The first part of the codicil was her father's true hand, looped and a little unsteady at the end, as his hands had grown. The added clause beneath it was a careful forgery, the letters too even, the ink a shade too fresh, and she had set her father's old account book beside it, so the bishop could compare the two with his own eyes. He had taken up his glass and bent over the pages for a long while, saying nothing, and then he had looked at her across the desk with an expression she would carry for the rest of her life, the expression of a man who has decided to believe a young woman against the easier story the world prefers. In the doing of it she had restored not her own fortune, which was past restoring, but the good name of a dead man who could no longer defend it, and she had done it at the cost of every shred of standing she had left, because to expose Fenn she had to stand up in the county and make public, in her own words, exactly how poor her father had died and exactly how she had been cheated. A wiser woman, the season would later say, would have kept silent and married quickly, and let the dead keep their debts. Eleanor had not been able to do it. The dead, in her experience, could not speak for themselves, and someone had to, and there had been no one else. This was the act the Duke had witnessed, not the booksellers, though. That had begun it. On the very evening she carried the codicil to the bishop. Adrian had been in Crail on his own business, sheltering under the eave of an inn while the rain came down, in the narrow street. And he had seen her come out of the bishop's house into the wet, with her shoulders straight and her face streaming and her father's papers clutched against her chest beneath her thin cloak. She had not seen him. She had stood a moment on the step to settle herself, and he had watched her square her shoulders against the rain, the way a soldier squares against a wind. And then she had walked off down the street alone, no carriage, no maid, a gentlewoman walking in the rain because she could no longer keep a carriage and would not say so. He had asked the bishop the next morning what the daughter of the late Mr. Crane had wanted. The bishop, who guarded confidences as a rule, had judged this one worth the breaking, and he had told him the whole of it, the forgery and the courage and the cost. The Duke had said nothing that morning. That same night the Dowager had laid before him the engagement to Marguerite, and Adrian had asked for 11 days, and he had spent them not in indecision, as Eleanor believed, but in a quiet and methodical fury, learning everything, buying Fenn's paper out from under him, and writing, again and again, a letter he could not find the shape of. He had not refused his mother aloud because he had learned, at her own knee, that you do not win against the Dowager by refusing, a refusal she could work with. A refusal she could call a fever, a phase, the strain of grief, a thing to be managed and waited out, and overruled in the end by the slow pressure she had brought to bear on his father before him. You did not win against her by saying no. You won by arriving with something she could not argue with, something already done, already sealed, already witnessed, a fact rather than a wish. So he had let her believe she was winning. He had let her set the date and order the flowers and write to Marguerite and seat 200 guests, and through all of it he had ridden out at dawn to Crail and to Wexley, and to the chambers of a solicitor named Pratt, saying nothing, paying for silence where silence could be bought, assembling piece by quiet piece the things she could not argue with. He had arranged for the something. He had not known the bishop would arrive with it first, or that the bishop would arrive carrying Eleanor herself, which was a thing he could not have arranged and would not have dared to ask for. In the chapel, the old man waited for his answer. He had asked the Duke whether he denied the letter of march, and the Duke had not yet spoken, and the silence had gone on long enough that the Dowager filled it again more sharply now, saying that this was an outrage, that the girl had no people, no money, no claim, that she was a debtor's daughter, and nothing more. There it was, voiced in the open church for the second time, in a different room and a different register. The same verdict, the pews had murmured at the door. A debtor's daughter, and nothing more. The phrase moved through the chapel, and several faces hardened into agreement. Eleanor felt the words land. She felt the old heat climb her throat. And she did the thing she had taught herself to do, across a long year of being reduced, which was to stand very still, and let the body hold what the dignity required, her chin level, her gloved hands quiet, at her sides, while inside her, a pulse beat so hard, she was certain the bishop could feel it through her arm. Adrian heard the phrase, too, and the audience of 200, watching his face, saw the stone change. It was not a large change. A muscle moved in his jaw. His eyes, which had been on Eleanor, went to his mother, and there was in them something the season had never been permitted to see. A cold, clear anger held on a very short rein. He still did not speak, because what he meant to do required the vicar and the settlements and the bishop's authority, and a man who has lived his whole life inside hierarchy knows that the strongest move is rarely the loudest one. He looked back at Eleanor, and across the cold air between the altar and the steps he held her gaze, and he let it linger past the point of comfort, past the point where Marguerite beside him turned to see what he was looking at, and the holding of that look was the first thing he had done in that chapel that belonged only to the two of them. Then he stepped down from the altar. One step, and the whole room leaned. Before I take you into what he said, let me hold you here a moment in the held breath of that chapel, because the rest moves quickly, and this stillness is the thing the story is built on. If a story of a woman finally seen is the kind that stays with you, leave a word below when it is done. Now, the Duke had taken one step down, and his mother had risen fully from her pew, and the bishop had laid his old hand more firmly on Eleanor's arm. What happened next did not happen all at once, because the Dowager did not surrender ground easily, and had one card left to play. She turned to the assembled guests, and she said, with the warm, reasonable confidence of a hostess, that her son was overwrought, that the strain of his late father's affairs had told on him, and that the wedding would proceed once the disturbance was removed. She gestured almost gently toward the side door through which Eleanor had come. She was inviting the room to agree that nothing was happening. It was a masterstroke of its kind. Half the chapel wanted desperately to believe it, because the alternative was to admit they had come to witness an injustice and applauded its arrangements. It was Marguerite who broke it, and not in the way anyone expected. The rival, the diamond, the cousin in white silk, had been watching the Duke's face for some moments, and she was not a stupid woman, and she had seen there the thing Eleanor could not yet see, and the Dowager refused to. She set down her bouquet on the altar rail with a small, deliberate click. She said in a clear voice that carried that she had agreed to marry a willing man, and that she did not see one before her. She said she would not be the instrument of anyone's dishonor, and she stepped back from the Duke's side. White silk and pearls and all, and the withdrawal of her certainty was the sound of the Dowager's entire arrangement beginning to come apart. The Dowager said her name once, sharply. Marguerite did not turn. Now Adrian crossed the floor. Not in 3 strides for drama, but slowly, with the whole church watching, down the chancel steps and along the worn stones to where Eleanor stood with the old bishop, and he stopped before her close enough that she had to tip her head to keep his eyes. And the season saw the Duke look at a debtor's daughter as though she were the only fixed point in a turning room. He did not perform it. That was what undid the watchers. There was no flourish in it. There was only a man arriving, finally, where he had meant to be for 11 days, and the arriving had the weight of all the nights it had cost him. He reached into the breast of his coat and drew out the thing he had been touching, and it was not a ring, and it was not the March letter. It was a deed. He held it so the bishop could see the seal, and he said, his voice level and pitched to carry, that the mortgage on Wexley was discharged, that Fenn's claim was bought and burned, and that the late Mr. Brand, Crane's name stood clean in the county records, as of the previous morning by his own hand and the bishop's witness. The Dowager went still. This was the something she could not argue with, and she recognized it, and the recognition moved across her face like cold across a window. Then Adrian turned to face the room, and he said, the thing that ended it. He did not make a speech. He said 8 words plainly. Into the silence the deed had made. I made my promise in March. I keep it. He reached for her hand, and he stopped, his fingers a breath from hers, and he looked at her as though to ask. It was the first time in 11 days that the Duke had asked anyone for anything, and the asking was in his face, and not in any word. And Eleanor, who had been turned from a locked door that morning, gave the smallest nod a person can give. Only then did he take her hand. He drew off her gloves slowly, 1 finger at a time, in front of 200 people, and the bareness of her hand in that cold, formal room was its own kind of vow, more naked than any spoken thing. She felt the warmth of his fingers reach the warmth of hers, and she felt her own pulse go to her wrist where his thumb rested. And she was aware, with a clarity that frightened her, of exactly where he stood, and exactly how he breathed, and the particular cold rain and cedar scent of him that she had carried out of a bookseller's shop in the spring, and had not let herself name, since her mouth stayed steady. Her hand in his was not steady at all, and he felt it, and he closed both of his around it, as if to keep it from being seen, which was the most private thing a man could do in the most public room in 3 counties. He held her bare hand in both of his, and the chapel made the sound a room makes when a verdict it had been certain of reverses itself in a single breath. It was not a cheer. It was something quieter and more complete. An exhale, the sound of an entire community recognizing, all together, that it had been wrong about a woman, and being, in its better part, glad to be wrong. The bishop did not let the moment rest on feeling alone. He stepped forward, and he said that as the prior promise was made in writing, and now affirmed in the sight of the church, he would himself read the banns and conduct the marriage this morning, if the lady consented. He looked at Eleanor. He had carried her into this room. He would not speak for her inside it. Eleanor looked up at Adrian. The wound in her, the year-old wound, the one that said a man could forget her by autumn, made one last attempt to speak. She heard it, and then she felt his thumb move once across the back of her bare hand, Not a caress so much as a steadying, the way a hand steadies a thing it is afraid to drop, and she understood, finally and entirely, that the stillness in him was not coldness. There had been a sister. Eleanor would learn the rest of it slowly, in the warm rooms of the months to come, but she understood its shape now from the way his hand closed over hers. A younger sister, years before, married off by the dowager to a man of suitable rank and unsuitable temper. While Adrian was away with his regiment, and the girl had written to him twice, and he had not come in time, and she had died in a cold house far from anyone who loved her. Of a fever the season called natural, and Adrian had never once called natural since. He had been 22. He had learned, in the worst way a young man can learn it, that the things he loved could be arranged away from him by people certain they knew best, and that softness shown too soon was a thing such people used as a handle. So he had become stone. He had let no one, least of all his mother, see what he valued, because to let her see it was to let her bargain with it. He had spent 11 days making certain that this time the thing he loved could not be arranged away, and he had said nothing to Eleanor of any of it, because saying it before the deed was done would have been to hand his mother the handle one last time. She said yes. She said it quietly. And only he and the bishop heard the word itself, but the whole chapel saw her chin come down in assent, and that was enough. The dowager left before the banns were finished. She did not flee. She rose, gathered her shawl with hands that were not quite steady, and walked the length of the aisle alone, with her head high, past the pews of people who had nodded with her an hour before, and who now studied their own gloves. No one stopped her. Adrian did not look at her go, which was its own kind of mercy, because to watch would have been to triumph, and he had not the smallest wish to triumph over his mother. He had only wished to be free of her arithmetic. At the door she paused, and for one moment she looked back, not at her son but at Eleanor, and what was in her face was not hatred. It was the particular bleak astonishment of a person discovering that the rules by which she had organized her entire life did not, after all, govern everything. Then she was gone, and the morning closed over the place where she had been. They were married in the plain light of mid-morning, with the borrowed grandeur of the great wedding still hanging in the flowers and the candles. A small true ceremony conducted inside the shell of a false one. Marguerite stayed. She stood as a witness at Eleanor's quiet request, and she signed the register in a clear, unhurried hand. And when it was done, the two women looked at each other with a wary new understanding. Two people who had each been used as a piece in another woman's game, and had each in her own way refused to stay a piece. It was not friendship, it was the beginning of the possibility of it, which is how most true friendships begin, in the recognition of a shared refusal. The season talked of nothing else for a fortnight. The story was carried into every drawing room in 3 counties, and in the carrying it changed, as such stories do, until the debtor's daughter became a heroine, and the duke became a man of feeling, and the dowager became a cautionary tale told to ambitious mothers. Eleanor heard the versions and let them pass. She had learned the precise worth of what a room decided about a person. She had been the thing the room decided against, and she had been the thing the room decided for, and she knew now that neither verdict was the truth of her. The truth of her was a girl on a wet shop floor handing a stranger an apple and telling him to make himself useful. Winter came early to Hartmoor that year. By the first week of December, the long windows of the Duke's library were furred with frost, and the fires were kept high, and Eleanor had taken to spending her evenings in the great room, among the leather book spines that smelled of dust and lamp oil and the particular piece of a house where she was no longer afraid. She was the Duchess of Hartmoor now, a thing the county still said with a small disbelieving pause, but inside the house no one paused. Inside the house she was simply Eleanor, and the Duke was simply Adrian, and the stone he wore in public had no business in these warm rooms, and did not come inside them. On a snowing evening near Christmas, she found him at the library window looking out at the white grounds, and she came and stood beside him in the firelight, and for a while neither of them spoke, because they had grown able to be silent together, which is a rarer gift than conversation. There was a piano in the corner of that room, left open, with a sheet of music she had been learning, still standing on the rack, broken off mid-phrase that afternoon, when the light had gone. There was a worn miniature of her father on the mantel, where she could see it from her chair, restored to a daughter who had restored his name. There was a dog asleep at the hearth, and a kettle somewhere down the corridor, and the small ordinary sounds of a house that had decided finally to be a home. The cold rain and cedar scent she had carried out of a bookseller's was simply the smell of the room, now the smell of every evening, and she had stopped being startled by her own happiness, which had taken longer than she expected, the unstartling. Then he reached into his coat, the same gesture she had watched him make in the chapel, the gesture she had learned to read, and he drew out, not a deed this time, but the letter. The March letter. The one she had carried folded against her ribs through every cold week. The one she had thought a foolish keepsake. He had asked for it gently on their wedding night, and she had given it to him. And she had not known what he meant to do with it. He had kept it. He had carried it since. He unfolded it now in the firelight, and she saw the soft creases worn into it, the creases her own carrying had made, and she understood that he had spent these weeks doing to her letter what she had done to it, learning its folds by heart. He did not read it aloud. He only laid it on the window ledge between them, in the cold light off the snow, and put his hand over hers on the sill, and outside the flakes came down without sound on the grounds that were now, by promise kept and name restored, as much hers as anyone's. The fire moved behind them. Somewhere down the corridor a clock chimed the hour she had once stood at a locked door waiting to be answered, and was answered now, every evening, simply by the fact of him beside her at a window in the warm. From far enough back, the two of them would have made a small, still figure in a great lit window, a man and a woman at a sill with a worn letter between them and the whole white country falling quiet around the house. And anyone passing on the dark road below would have taken them for two people who had always belonged exactly there, and would have been right, though it had cost more than passing strangers could ever know to make it true. She had walked into a church on the arm of a bishop because no one else would open the door. She would never again need anyone to open a door for her in that house. The letter lay in the snow light, worn soft by two hands now instead of one, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. If Eleanor's journey moved you, stay a moment in the quiet of it, before you go, and know that somewhere a door you thought was shut may only be waiting for the right hand on the latch. Thank you for staying until the end.